Unit 6, Consequences of Industrialization from 1750 to 1900. Unit 6, Subunit 1, Rationals for Imperialism. Imperialism is the motives for establishing overseas empires, which led to conflicts in Asia and the scramble to colonize Africa. The various motives were nationalism, a desire for economic wealth, a sense of religious duty, and a belief they were biologically superior, which stems from social Darwinism. In Western Europe, a revolution gave rise to nationalism and the creation of nation-states characterized by the 1800s. A strong sense of identity and loyalty to state asserted authority over territories. European nationalism was brought about after losing American colonies, and new lands were looked to open settlement. Britain got Australia and gradually took control of India from East Indian Company, which was controlled the entire Indian subcontinent. France compensated its humiliating defeat by Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War by expanding overseas territories. Italy and Germany were newly unified states and wanted colonies not only for economic and strategic reasons, but also for the prestige. Japan asserted its nationalist pride through Korea. This irritated China, which exerted a strong presence in Korea for many centuries. This boiled into the Sino-Japanese War, which was known as the Formosa for the time of Japan seized Taiwan, which was known as the Formosa. Phrenologists studied skull sizes and shapes and believed that a smaller skull size proved the mental feebleness of Africans, indigenous Americans, and Asians. These ideas are clearly false and have been proven. But this was used to support imperialism. British scientist Charles Darwin came up with the theory of evolution by natural selection and stated that over millions of years, biological competition had weeded out the weaker species and that the fittest species would be the ones that survived. This created social Darwinism, which was not related to Darwinism itself, in which Darwin was not a supporter of. It was just another means to further imperialism by these powerful countries. Moving on to the cultural ideologies. Colonizers introduced their own language, which helped unify diverse colonies, and also introduced political, educational, and religious institutions, which affected everyday life. Another motive was religion. Missionaries were among the most tireless civilizing influences. Like the Spain and Portugal Catholic missionaries who combined the conquest of evangelism during the Age of Discovery. British Protestant missionaries of the 18th and 19th century participated in colonization. These missionaries often set up schools for instruction in religion, improved medicines and medical care, and most famously, David Livingstone from Scotland worked in sub-Saharan Africa to end the illegal slave trade. The East India Company was granted a royal charter in 1600 by the English monarch, who was giving it a monopoly of England's trade with India. Eventually, the EIC expanded from the Persian Gulf to East Asia, and by the beginning of the 18th century, became a major agent of British imperialism in India, and became a managing agency in India. The Dutch East Indian Company gave a monopoly in trade between the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa and the Straits of Magellan at the top of southern tip of South America. This VOC concentrated on the islands around Java, replacing Portuguese, who controlled the region. The corruption and debt of the government led to take control of the company's possessions, creating now Indonesia. The new imperialism, which was after the Industrial Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, Britain was leading the economic power throughout the first half of the 19th century and had sizable colonial power. This power from the colonies provided raw materials such as cotton, wool, jute, vegetable oils, and rubber for factories. As the Second Industrial Revolution went on, other nations began to actually challenge Britain's economic lead.
Subunit 2. State expansion. King Leopold II of Belgium wanted the Belgian government to conquer colonies in a large swath of Central Africa, the Congo Basin. The government was so ambivalent, so Leopold established a private colony himself. However, the Belgian parliament found the king's rule so abusive that in 1908, it took control of the region away from him. Similarly, the Dutch government revoked the charter of the Dutch East India Company for abusing its power to make treaties, build forts, and maintained armed forces in Southeast Asia. While these unusual shifts of power were taking place, other European governments, as well as the United States, Russia, Japan, continued territorial expansion through conquest and settlement. Imperialism in Africa. Europe had a long-standing relationship with Africa because of the slave trade. Although most European countries had declared the importation of Africans as slave labor illegal in the early 1800s, Europeans continued to export guns, alcohol, and other manufactured goods to Africa and import African natural resources such as palm oil, gold, and ivory. England desired palm oil in particularly because it kept machinery in its textile factories from becoming rusty. In the last part of the 19th century, European taste for African diamonds and ivory kept European empires thriving throughout the African continent. The European scramble for Africa. Tensions mounted among industrialized European nations as they competed for natural resources in Africa. Leaders feared that the scramble for Africa, the competing efforts for Europeans to colonize Africa, would lead to war. Berlin Conference. Unlike many German leaders who had imperial ambitions, Otto von Bismarck had little interest in colonies. However, he did want to keep peace in Europe, so in 1884 to 1885, he hosted the Berlin Conference, a meeting of European powers to provide for the orderly organization of Africa. No Africans were invited to the conference. European powers peaceably agreed to colonial boundaries and to the free movement of goods on Africa's major rivers, such as the Niger River and the Congo River. In most of the continent, Europeans established colonial borders that were merely artificial lines that meant little to the people that lived within them. These borders divided long unified societies into different colonies and united longtime rival groups into the same colonies. When these colonies became independent states in the later 20th century, these borders became the cause of extensive warfare by making national unity very difficult. Imperialism in South Asia. France established trading ports in the 17th century. However, its loss to Britain in the global conflict known as the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, drove the French out of India. England's East India Company steadily encroached on the land of the weak Mughal Empire. Eventually, Britain controlled the entire Indian subcontinent from Pakistan to the west, Kashmir, in the north to Bengal, in the east to the island of Sri Lanka in the south. Imperialism in East Asia. China did not experience imperialism in the same way the South Asia or Africa did. It maintained its own government throughout a period of European economic domination. As a result of superior military strength, European nations carved out spheres of influence within China over which they had exclusive trading rights and access to natural resources. Internal problems with the Qing government, such as the Taiping Revolution or Rebellion, made it easier for foreign countries to dominate the economic affairs in China. U.S. imperialism in Latin America and the Pacific. During the 19th century, the United States continued taking land from indigenous peoples as Europeans had done since Columbus arrived. One notorious episode was the forced relocation of eastern woodlands peoples from the southeast to a new Indian territory in what is now Oklahoma. So many Native Americans died from exposure, malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion that this forced migration became known as the Trail of Tears. In 1823, President James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine, which stated that European nations should not intervene in the affairs of the countries in the Western Hemisphere. Implied in the doctrine was a desire to be an imperial power in the Americas. This desire played out in the U.S. war with Mexico, 1845 to 1848, though with which the United States gained vast territories in the southwest from Mexico. The U.S. victory in the Spanish-American War in 1898 brought Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines under U.S. control. President Theodore Roosevelt, a proponent of social Darwinism, was especially eager to expand U.S. influence throughout the Western Hemisphere. In 1904, Roosevelt, corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, stated that if countries in Latin America demonstrated instability, the United States would intervene. It did several times. For example, in 1904, Roosevelt sent U.S. troops to occupy a Caribbean island nation, the Dominican Republic, until it repaid its foreign debts.
Unit 6, Subunit 3, Indigenous Responses to State Expansion. In the Balkan Peninsula, the Ottoman Empire stretched deep into Europe. However, it started to lose its hold on its remaining European territories. The French Revolution inspired ethnic nationalism emerging in the Balkans, which wanted independence. This growing ethnic tension set the stage for World War I. Serbia and Greece won independence only after long wars. Bosnia, Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Bulgaria all rebelled against Ottoman rule. In 1877, Serbia and Russia came to their aid, and was the last and most important Russo-Turkish War. The Proclamation of 1763 was an act that reserved all land between the Appalachian Mountains and Mississippi River for Native Americans. For the first time, a European government had recognized the rights of indigenous people. The Cherokee Nation, which assimilated to white settler culture, adopted many methods of farming, weaving, and building after 1800. The entire tribe became literate and adopted a constitution based on the U.S. Constitution. Congress passed an Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forced tribes to relocate to what is now Oklahoma. U.S. expansionism continued, affecting many Native American people. Prophet dreamers among the northern Paiute Indian announced the dead would come back and drive out the whites. This ghost dance rituals were a combination of dances and songs that were meant to speed up the event. This went from Sierra Nevada to Missouri River in northern Texas to the Canadian border. Tupac Amaru II was born in 1714 and identified with Incan heritage. He received a formal Jesuit education, but was arrested and executed. And he arrested and executed a formal administrator, charging him with cruelty. This sparked the match for the last general Indian revolt against Spain. Benito Juarez, a full-blooded Zapote, tried to overthrow Benito Juarez was almost overthrown with Mexican conservatives that conspired with Napoleon III. Mexico owned France money, and Napoleon III wanted to further his imperialist ambitions, so he offered to make Europeans them nobles. In South Asia, however, the Sepoy Indian soldiers, who were under the British made up the majority of armed forces in India. The Indian Rebellion of 1847 was brought about when the British were trying to convert them to Christianity and used rifle cartridges which were greased with fat of cows and pigs. Hindus view these cows as sacred, and Muslims refused to parsley pigs. Thousands were killed in the rebellion and was a turning point in the mark of emergence of Indian nationalism. Britain exiled the Mughal Empire for involvement in the rebellion and ended the Mughal Empire consequently. The British Raj was the colonial government that took its orders directly from the British government in London. And the Raj established the Indian National Congress, which began as a forum for telling the problems to the colonial government and began to call for self-rule. In South Africa, Western educated Africans had a shared identity, nationalism, which was known as Pan-Africanism. The Soko Caliphate was in West Africa, and in the 18th century, rulers often mixed Islamic and traditional religious practices. Usman Dan Fodio started a movement to purify Islam among the Hausa tribes of the region. This created the Sokoto Caliphate and established trade as a means of economic growth, while, on the other hand, the British were actually trying to stop it. This made the British Navy attempt to intercept the ships of the Sokoto Caliphate to free thus enslaved people. They relocated them in the colony of Sierra Leone. The Sokoto Caliphate was one of the largest empires in the 16th century. In South Africa, the native Zoko people did not want to be ruled by Europeans, whether Dutch, English, or whatever. The Zoko began to kill their cattle to destroy crops, believing that would cause the spirits to remove British settlers. This resulted in the Koso cattle killing movement, and actually was a famine and deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. However, the British were still not driven out of the area. While this was all happening, the Mahdist revolt in East Africa was happened, where Muhammad Ahmed declared himself the Mahdi, or guided one, that would restore glory to Islam. The Sudanese actually resented Egyptian rule for decades, and with the arrival of the British in 1873, it only fueled resentment. The Mahdists finally overran the British Empire in January 1885 after Ahmed's death in June that year. The British returned to Sudan in 1896 and finally defeated the Mahdists in September 1898.
Subunit 4, Global Economic Development. Economics was among the most influential of the several motives driving imperialism. Britain industrialized rapidly during the 1700s and the 1800s in order to feed industry's desires for raw materials such as cotton, copper, and rubber. Europe looked to Asia and Africa. American agriculture, as noted by President Fillmore, looked to South America for fertilizer. The people of these continents were also potential consumers of European and American manufactured goods. Finally, colonial peoples provided the labor for large-scale projects such as building railroads or telegraph lines. Colonial workers were paid meager wages for difficult and dangerous labor. In short, natural resources, new markets, and low-wage labor drove economic imperialism. Railroads were very important, as well as steamships and telegraphs. Cash crops were commonplace throughout all of these places so they can support their economies with the money they make off of the cash crops, hence the name cash crop. There was lots of economies that were export economies that based their economy off of selling raw materials that then the other economy would be manufacturing the raw material into a manufactured good. This, for an example of this, was rubber. Yep. Minerals were another example of raw materials, such as gold that was turned into jewelry, and diamonds, which are very popular jewelry today. There was apartheid in Africa, or racial segregation, that plagued South Africa during the 20th century. Consequences of commercial extraction. Farmers were allowed to raise only cash crops such as sugar, cocoa, or groundnuts at expense of other agricultural products. This use of land led to monocultures or lack of agricultural diversity, particularly in developing nations. Large areas were often cleared of forests to make room for farming, which took its toll on both biodiversity and the climate. Cash crops such as cotton rapidly depleted the soil's natural fertility. Moreover, crop diseases and pests spread more easily when there is only one crop planted in an area. Today, many former colonies have been unable to re-diversify their land use because of the development of monocultures has badly damaged croplands. As a result, they often must import basic agricultural goods in order to feed their people.
Unit 6, Subunit 5, Economic Imperialism. The Industrial Revolution provided a new source of cotton from America, which allowed Britain to flood the market with inexpensive textiles. Usually, before that, India was the world's leading supplier of cotton textiles. India was only producing raw cotton for Britain by the late 18th century, and not cotton textiles. Another raw material that was critical for Britain was the drug, opium, which was from poppies that grew in South Asia. This flooded Chinese markets, and the conflict was resulting in the First Opium War. A situation in which foreign businesses have interest in great economy, power, or influence, developed as businesses took advantage of natural resources beyond their borders, is called economic imperialism. Peoples, raw materials, refined materials, and main resources were all exploited. In India, the East Indian Company was formed in 1600 that was used to engage in lucrative spice trade. Soon the company ran into opposition, ops, from the Dutch, and by the mid 1600s, silk textiles from India replaced the spices, and those the company dominated the world textile trade. The Dutch East Indian Company had a monopoly on the trade of the Dutch East Indies in present-day Indonesia, where the Spice Islands were located. The culture system, which forced farmers to choose between growing crops, cash crops for export, or performing corvée labor, which was compulsory unpaid work. This system left villagers with either the choice of one-fifth the rice fields for such export crops such as sugar, coffee, or indigo, or work in a government field for 66 days if they had no such land. In China, opium became an addictive drug that relieves pain and reduces stress. The company sold it for silver in China, where millions became addicted to the illegal drug and then made the country submissive. The First Opium War from 1839 to 1842 seized the British opium warehouse in the port of Canton, Guangzhou, and the war broke out where British warships destroyed a Chinese blockade. China did not anticipate the power of the industrial nations such as Britain and showed the shift of power that was taking place. Nations in Europe would become to dominate and defeat states that lacked military technology, and technology was needed to stand up against these tyrants. The Treaty of Nanking required China to open up 4 additional ports, cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain, and pay for damages. It also forced Chinese to allow free trade, which the British took to include trade in opium. Neither Britain or China were completely satisfied with this treaty. The British wanted opium legalized, while the Chinese were unhappy about concessions they were being forced to make. The spheres of influence. In Japan, France, Germany, Russia, and the United States all wanted trading privileges that the British obtained after the Opium Wars. By the end of the century, these nations began forcing China to give them exclusive trading rights and territory. So this became spheres of influence. At the time, the open door policy proposed by the United States allowed for a trade system in which all countries equally wanted and had the same power to keep control of China away. Reliance on cash crops, one grown to be sold in a country or a region, left many Africans vulnerable during periods of drought, economic decline, or falling world prices. Food production declined as farmers chose to plant cash crops such as cotton that would increase the value of land, but leaving food shortages. Even famine could arrive because the most land was devoted to cash crops. Egypt embraced cotton as a cash crop, and so did Sudan, Uganda, and in Kenya, most people were hoarders, where groups like the Kikuyu moved to reserves with poor soil and bad climates. Missionaries introduced the area in the 1880s, where cacao became the great cash crop on the Gold Coast. This region became the largest cacao producer in the world. And it's also an important cash crop in the Ivory Coast, Nigeria, and Portuguese colonies of Sao Tome and Angola. In Africa, slavery was outlawed in British colonies in 1833, but it was everywhere else. So, until 1912, the slave raiding and trading was suppressed in most of Africa, and slavery was actually not abolished until the first quarter of the 20th century. Slavery produced many cash crops. The United States wasn't a huge world power like Britain or France, but it did use the second industrial revolution to bring prosperity and republic to the U.S. Investments were made, and in Argentina, the British had invested more in Argentina than its own colony of India. The Pampas improved breeding stock and developed large-scale farming throughout the greasy plains. This also financed infrastructure for building projects such as the telegraph systems and railroads. In Chile, Spain colonized the region, and Chile's economic development was dependent on the export of agricultural produce. In Brazil, the once booming rubber industry declined as growing rubber in Malaysia was at a lower cost. In the Caribbean, banana republics were used to describe small Central American countries under the economic power of the foreign-based corporations. These republics were politically unstable states with an economy dependent upon the exportation of limited resources such as bananas or minerals. Hawaii was made a territory of the U.S. after a group of businesses and sugar planters in Hawaii overthrew the constitutional monarchy in 1893.
Subunit 6: Causes of Migration in an Interconnected World. An increasingly global economy characterized by economic imperialism and the availability of different modes of transportation promoted a new era of migrations. As industrialization grew, populations moved to urban centers. Some workers who left their homeland, such as Lebanese merchants in their native country, for visits or to retire. Others, like the Irish settler, quoted difficulties. Other movements of people were coerced to meet the demands for workers. Coerced and semi-coerced migration of people resulted in slavery, indentured servitude, and convict labor. Indian laborers migrated to British colonies in the Caribbean, South Africa, East Africa, and Fiji. Chinese laborers migrated to California and British Malaya to build railroads and serve as farmhands, gardeners, and domestics. Japanese laborers migrated to Hawaii, Peru, and Cuba to work on sugar plantations. Most countries in the Americas abolished the American slave trade in the early 19th century. Slavery itself continued, but without a fresh supply of enslaved people, the institution declined. In spite of prohibitions, Africans continued enslaving one another well into the 20th century. As slavery was being abolished, labor was still desired, so imperial colonies turned to other forms of coerced labor. Indentured servitude: people who worked for a set number of years before becoming free were indentured servants. Many people became indentured as a way to pay for their transportation from a desperately poor community to one with one more opportunity. Others were forced to do so to pay off debt. People migrated from Ireland for many reasons. Some left for political reasons, but many left because of the Great Famine, 1845 to 1849, that destroyed the potato crop for 4 years. As many as 3 million people immigrated from Ireland. Most went to the United States, but many others went to England, Scotland, Canada, or Australia. Before 1868, Japan was closed to the rest of the world. However, in 1893, the Japanese government had decided that Japan should acquire overseas empire and established the Colonization Society. Its aim was to export Japan's surplus population as well as commercial goods. In 1892, this society made an unsuccessful attempt to start an agricultural settler colony in Mexico. And finally, I will talk about migration, transportation, and urbanization. Improvements in transportation technology allowed some who migrated for work reasons to return to their home societies, either for a period of time or permanently. For example, in 1885, an agreement between the governments of Japan and Hawaii allowed Japanese laborers to go to Hawaii to work on the sugar plantations under 3-year contracts. Approximately 29,000 Japanese went to Hawaii over the next 9 years. During that time, thousands more went to other destinations in the South Pacific, including Australia, New Caledonia, and Fiji under similar contracts. Most plan to return home after a few years.
Unit 6, Subunit 7, Effects of Migration. No matter whatever reason migration was, migration in the 19th century led to demographic changes with long-lasting results. Laborers tended to be male and from particular ethnic groups such as Indian indentured servants brought to work on sugar plantations of the Caribbean, or Chinese laborers recruited to work on the transcontinental railroad in the U.S. The experiences are very widely diverse depending on the norms and home cultures, but migrant workers were more often male than female, and an external or internal conflict brought a shift in the demographics of gender roles in societies which they left. Some societies, male waited to emigrate until a male relative was able to live and support the women. In some places, women's roles were much the same as before the husbands left. In some places, women gained some autonomy and authority as they took on responsibilities once filled by their husbands. Immigrants also were interested in a new economic start, but wanted to carry their own tradition and culture. Ethnic enclaves, or clusters of neighborhoods of people from the same foreign country, formed in many major cities of the world. They spoke the same language, ate the foods, were familiar from home, and pursued a way of life which was similar but a little different in their home countries. Chinese enclaves migrated from South Asia and thrived under colonial rule. In Indochina, the French encouraged them to engage in commerce. And Chinese immigrants came from the U.S. came to the U.S. during the height of the California gold rush. Many worked in the mines, but some found occupation on farms in the San Francisco garment industry. And Chinese laborers actually became indispensable during construction of the first transcontinental railroad. Indian enclaves. When the British Empire abolished slavery in 1833, it was replaced by a system which was a little barely better, indentured servitude, which was among the first indentured servants to work in British colonies. Many Indians went to Madras Islands off the southeast coast of Africa and Natal, a colony that is part of South Africa, and worked on sugar plantations. The Hindu and Muslim population of South Africa was divided by class, language, and religion. This resulted in injustice and discrimination, which became the central work of a young Indian named Mohammedas Gandhi. Mohandas. He arrived in Pretoria, South Africa, and wanted to practice law. When he suffered many counts of racial discrimination, he became an activist. He formed the Natal Indian Congress, which goal was to expose the world to the rampant discrimination against Indians in South Africa. Indians in South Asia. Between 1834 and 1937, India was a major source of labor for the British and Southeast Asian colonies. The indentured servitude was replaced by the Konangai system, which entire families were created to work on tea, coffee, and rubber plantations in Ceylon, Burma, and Malaya. And their lives were a little less restricted than those indentured servitudes and had the advantage of having their families with them. Many Indians in the Caribbean were sent out to work on sugar plantations in and around the Caribbean and are the second largest and comprise the largest ethnic group in Guyana and Trinidad and the Tobago, and are the second largest in many others. Irish enclaves in North America are Scots who previously migrated to Ireland and are often referred as Scot Irish. Most came as indentured servants and paid their own passage. Many men from the United States helped construct the canal system. And in Canada, many Irish farmed. Most Irish immigrants were able to create decent lives. In Argentina, Italians took up almost half of the European immigrants to Argentina and were about 55% of the Argentinian population. They spread their words and culture all around the country. In the US, regulation was much needed and powerful enough that in California, a revised constitution ratified several positions. In this state, counties, municipalities, and public works from hiring Chinese workers, prevented individuals from China to work on white grounds, and encouraged cities to either remove Chinese residents or limit and segregate them in certain areas. But Congress banned further Chinese immigration by passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, limited to a 10-year period, and extended periodically and made permanent in 1903. It was actually finally repealed in 1943, which showed the discrimination of the United States. The Chinese Immigration Regulation Restriction Act in 1861 is when several thousand white miners attacked the Chinese and plundered their dwellings. Many acts were passed to stop and restrict the Chinese in America. And Chinese enclaves, also known as Chinatowns, developed in cities across Australia and Northern Territory. Although in Australia, Chinese were declining, they were becoming more concentrated in Melbourne and Sydney, and more visible. The White Australia policy, as it was known, remained in effect until the mid-1970s.
Finally, the subunit 8, causation in the imperial age. Industrial capitalism caused significant developments between 1750 and 1900. The manufacturing capacity of industrialized nations caused an increase in the availability, affordability, and variety of both capital and consumer goods. However, this increased industrial capacity also led to an increased demand for natural resources. This conquest of Earth to manufacture these goods. Additionally, domestic markets soon became saturated, leading industrialized nations to seek out foreign markets to soak up the excess production. Competition for these markets increased among industrialized economies, especially those in the West. To reduce competition and increase profits, Western nations continued to look to empire building begun in the previous era as in the solution to these challenges. The imperialism in the 19th century also caused significant effects, including increased migration, the rise of independence movements within the colonies, and increased political and economic rivalry among Western European nations that would lead to catastrophic events in the early 20th century. Over the years, exports as a percentage of the output increased drastically, going from around 7% to a little bit below 30% from the years 1820 to 1890. That is not that much time.
That's not that much time.
I agree with you. In the late 1700s, the former North American colonies of Great Britain revolted against its colonial rule and declared themselves an independent nation. Shortly after, France threw off the yoke of the monarchy and established a republic. In the early 1800s, former Spanish and Portuguese colonies in South America also became independent states. One of the more significant effects of modern imperialism was the migration from dependent or less industrial areas of the world to the dominant industrial economies. People immigrated from rural areas to urban areas within countries and less developed areas in Europe to more developed areas of Europe. Immigrants looking for economic opportunity left many European countries, settled in the United States and Canada, often making up a large proportion of the industrial workforce. Some immigrants signed contracts to travel to areas to work for a prescribed period of time, pay back the costs, of their transport and then either settle in these areas or return to their homelands. These indentured laborers, as they were called, came from China, Japan, South Asia, and Europe, and found themselves working and living in the Americas, Southeast Asia, Africa, or Australia. If they chose to settle in their host home country, often these immigrants face discrimination based on race, religion, and other factors. The spread of global capitalism resulted in the accumulation of wealth by the middle and upper classes, while the working classes in the industrial economies already exploited by the profit motive found themselves in direct competition for jobs with immigrants from non-industrial countries. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.